Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, a podcast devoted to exploring perspectives on sustainable development by young professionals working in the field. Sense and Sustainability is a collaborative effort with Consilience, the Journal of Sustainable Development at Columbia University. I'm your host, Ji-Sung Park, of the University of Oxford. Our email address is sense.sustainability@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts about today's show, in addition to any suggestions you might have regarding ideas for future episodes. And as always, thanks for tuning in. My guest today is Abdul El-Sayed. Abdul is a PhD student in the Public Health Department, or a DPhil as they call it here, at Oxford University, where he is also a Rhodes Scholar. Abdul is also an MD PhD student at Columbia University, where he'll resume his studies in the fall. And last and certainly not least, Abdul is a great personal friend of mine. Abdul, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Abdul and I are going to talk primarily about health and inequality in conjunction with issues of sustainable development. But first, for the listeners who aren't too familiar with what your major field of study is all about, epidemiology, walk us through what the discipline pertains to, and also just a little bit about how you got interested, how you got started in that field of study.
Sure. So epidemiology, we'll start from maybe an etymological perspective. It comes from the two words epi and demos. Epi means what's upon. Demos means the population. So very literally, it's the study of what's upon the population. Generally, I think in modern parlance, it refers to the study of the determinants of disease at a population level. Epidemiologic research tends to take one of two strains. One strain is description, whereby we attempt to measure metrics of health and disease among the population. And then the second is etiologic inquiry, where we attempt to understand what causes disease in a population.
Okay. And how did you get interested in that?
So I'd always been interested in people and science. And in the beginning, that led me to an interest in a career in medicine. My senior year in college, actually, I played lacrosse for the university at the time, and
this is the University of Michigan, by the way.
Of Michigan, and my senior year, I actually decided not to play, and I was looking for something to occupy my time, and I hadn't actually done any type of research, which is uncommon among applicants to medical school.
Uh-huh.
And so I knew I was interested in quote-unquote public health, not really knowing what I was getting myself into, and I'd emailed a series of professors, one of whom got back to me. And the project that I was assigned to work on was a mixed method analysis where they were using epidemiologic and anthropological methods to try and understand the way that disasters develop in populations. Which this project wasn't strictly an epidemiologic project per se, given its methodology and really the goals of the work. But one of the postdocs with whom I was working actually showed me a paper written by Diane Lauderdale at the University of Chicago, published in Demography in 2006, where she looked at the birth outcomes of Arab-named women in the 6-month period following 9/11 as compared to the same 6-month period in the year prior. With the argument that after 9/11, Arab Americans were almost thrust into a position of a minority where their identity was perceived as somehow negative.
So they were under a lot of stress.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And so that the stress could have impact on their birth outcomes. And what she showed actually is in the 6-month period following 9/11, Arab-named women were significantly more likely to have preterm and low birth weight infants as compared to that same cohort in the 6-month period prior to 9/11, the same 6-month period in the year prior, which was incredible to me insofar as you could show the effect of something as macrosocial as 9/11 on something as biologically relevant as preterm birth or low birth weight.
And personal.
Personal, right, given I'm Arab American in background. So I just found this incredibly interesting, and from there I sought to basically recreate the study in Michigan with the idea that in Michigan we have a very large Arab American population, such that the effects of producing a minority out of Arab Americans in Michigan might have been mitigated. And so we actually ended up writing that paper, and it was published in 2008 in Ethnicity and Disease. And we actually showed that there was no effect of 9/11 on Arab-named women in the 6 months following 9/11 as compared to the same 6-month period in the year prior.
And so the hypothesis there being that because it was such a large Arab population, you didn't have as many stressors.
Well, not necessarily as many stressors, but that
Well,
the mechanisms by which Arab Americans would have been stressed following 9/11 wouldn't have been as great
So
because
they're
people are
dampened
by just the sheer size of the Arab population and the fact that people are familiar with them. So it was, and from there we just generated a series of other hypotheses, and from there I fell in love with epidemiologic research, and I've been doing it since.
And you never
It's not that long.
stopped. Never stopped. Great. So we'll obviously get into some of the interdisciplinary and philosophical points of these discussions in a bit, but let's start with formalizing some of our terms. You mentioned preterm birth. Define for us, if you will, some metrics of health outcomes. What do we mean when we say health outcomes?
Okay. So a health outcome would be a formal representation of health in the way that it's experienced by a population.
Okay.
Right? So when we think about what does health mean to somebody, right? Epidemiologists try and fudge a definition that will allow us to measure that meaning in some important way.
Right.
Now, one way to measure this would be length of life, right? And so a very common health statistic that one will hear about is life expectancy,
right,
or all-cause mortality, which is a measure on length of life, but that ignores the quality of life in that interim. Another, maybe on the other extreme, would be a metric like self-reported well-being, which is a metric of how somebody might be feeling with regard to their health at a given period, but has no bearing on quote-unquote objective length of life.
Right.
Now, there are other metrics that look at other outcomes of potential interest. It's things like, for example, preterm birth, where we're interested in the number of weeks gestation a child the population, the average child in the population of interest is spending in the womb, as compared to an objective measure of what's quote unquote regular.
Right.
So preterm birth, for example, is fewer than 37 weeks gestation.
And we care about preterm birth because they're associated with negative outcomes later.
Later on in life, exactly. And so we use these outcomes regularly as proxies for the overall idea of health. And some proxies are more important than others because they predict other outcomes later on. Or some might be particularly relevant to particular areas in medicine. Now, one of the mantras in public health is that any type of study that we do with the focus of intervention in mind.
Right.
And so when we look at particular outcomes, right, those interventions normally fall on policy or clinical guidelines.
Yeah.
Now, clinicians, because they tend to be specialized, have particular interests in particular outcomes. So, for example, if you're an ophthalmologist or you're an eye doctor, you're interested in outcomes of the eye, right? And so you're going to be interested in the distribution of certain eye diseases, whether it be glaucoma or cataracts in a population, and then understanding what causes those outcomes. Versus people who are more general might be interested in life expectancy, infant mortality, which is the number of infants who die before the age of 1, all-cause mortality, general well-being, etc.
So it seems like even within the discipline, there isn't and probably can't really ever be complete agreement as to which health outcomes are the ones that are the best to use. I guess some are better in certain situations, right, and some are better depending on where you sit.
Right. I mean, the fundamental problem here philosophically is that the experience of health is intersubjective.
Exactly.
Right? What's important to you in your health is different than what's important to me in my health, which may be different from what's important to some individual living in China in his or her health. And so conversations about how we should be measuring health become relatively contested, right? Because each of us would say that a certain example of health is more important than another. And also, what a particular political actor will do about his or its quote-unquote health outcomes really depends on the outcome that you're interested in. So, for example, if you can show that general or self-reported well-being is really high, but then life expectancy is really low, then that suggests that people are living happy lives while they're alive, but that they're dying a lot earlier than others.
Right.
At the other end of it, you could say that in certain contexts, people have very long life expectancy,
But they're unhappy for the last 20 years.
Precisely,
Yeah.
precisely. And then from there, economists are really interested in outcomes like DALYs or QALYs, which are quality or disability adjusted life years, which attempt to negotiate between this length versus quality dilemma.
In effect, this speaks to how often Abdul and I talk about these things, because he basically read my mind where I was going to go with this in mentioning the dailies and what the economists would look at here. And part of what I find so fascinating about epidemiology in general, and most of my exposure, again, is through our conversations, but part of what I find so interesting is the fact that in economics, oftentimes we're measuring proxies for well-being as well.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of ways, they're even one step more removed than health. Health is, to me, a fundamentally outcome-based thing, right? It's an outcome. You're either healthy or you're not. You either report that you're healthy or you're not.
Yeah.
And again, all kinds of difficulties and issues in terms of which metric you use.
Mm-hmm. So what you're reflecting is it tends to be a more of a categorical or binary outcome versus a continuum, where, for example, the amount of money that you could have is theoretically infinite and continuous.
Oh,
right?
Well, I was actually that's actually a good point. So what I was referring to was actually not that so much as the instrumental versus the end nature.
Okay, fair. Yeah.
So economists are all about. I mean, our only real proxy that we ever use is GDP.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of personal issues with that, and I'm sure a lot of people do. But at least in your right, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's GDP as hopefully as a means to all these ends.
Right.
Which the GDP is a measure of income which is filtered through some individual's utility function, and that individual maximizes his or her utility based on his preferences and uses that income to buy the things that he or she needs to achieve the outcomes that he or she wants.
Right.
Whereas we're kind of going the opposite direction with epidemiology and health in general. You're saying health is a priori a good thing, and I think no one would really argue with that.
Right.
And therefore, we're going to measure the outcomes. And almost immediately when we measure the outcomes, we start making normative judgments as to the situation at hand.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because either a good outcome is lacking or it's there.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about health is that, it's both a means and an end, right? So
that's another interesting point.
It's an end insofar as we would all agree that without good health, without good health, there really is nothing else. I mean, I think there's a famous quote by Descartes, which says something very similar. But at the same time, having good health allows you to do and function in a lot of other ways. So it's kind of a prerequisite as a means, but then also a very important end. But interestingly, as an end, it doesn't necessarily function like material goods can function as an end, because studies have shown that people are motivated, right? They're incentivized by material goods as ends. Although with health, it's a very bad incentive, right? Because
in what sense?
The counterfactual isn't necessarily there. So, for example, in a population relevant sense, to say that you should do this thing so that you will live this much longer doesn't seem as ethically appropriate, maybe, as saying you should do this thing so that you can have this thing.
Right, and it also seems harder to conceptualize.
Right.
You can conceptualize having a yacht.
Right.
Working towards having a yacht.
Right.
I have trouble conceptualizing, being 20% more healthy when I'm 50.
Right. But at the micro level, we do make decisions like that all the time. Right?
True.
Like when we say, I'm going to eat right and exercise, I do that because I want to be 20% more healthy when I'm 50.
And when you say, I'm not going to go to practice for the rest of this term because I just had a concussion and I don't want to risk serious long-term injury, that again is also the choice that you're making. Okay, fair enough. So I think this is a really good segue into probably the main thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, which is the notion of inequalities in health.
Right.
And I can see this being an issue at least in two dimensions. One being in terms of inequalities in the actual outcomes, right? Inequalities in life expectancy, what have you. But the other also in terms of how other inequalities, say inequalities in income or access to, certain supermarkets, whatever, map onto health outcomes. And they're obviously very, very closely related. Give us some of your thoughts on